Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai to this webinar on Ināia tonu, a low emissions future for Aotearoa. For Wales taku ingoa. I'm a principal analyst at the Commission and also the team lead for Land and Waste. I want to start by asking Ben Abraham to open with a karakia.
Kia ora Phil and tēnā koutou. Called Ben Abraham Aho, and I'm a senior analyst at the Commission and the Land team, working with Phil and the rest on forestry and agriculture issues. It's great to be back for some more webinars. I know we did lots after the draft advice, and it's great to now do some for our final advice. Ināia tonu nei. Kia karakia tātou. Whakatakatia hau ki te uru. Whakatakatia hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta. Kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te a tā kura. He tio, he huka, he hau hu. Ti hei mauri ora.
Tēnā koe Ben. Thank you. So we delivered this advice on the 31st of May to the Minister for Climate Change, who then tabled it in Parliament on the 9th of June. We called it Ināia tonu nei, which translates as the time is now, reiterating that Aotearoa needs to take action now. We're also working hard to release the underlying analysis, and I note that the C-Plan model, or climate policy analysis model, was put on our website yesterday, and you can register to get access for that if you're interested. Today, we're going to talk through the policy recommendations for forests, agriculture and waste, and then we're going to follow that up with a question and answer session. The team will talk through the advice with Sally Garden giving some of the broader context on our advice, followed by Sandra Valade talking on forests and other removals. Ben Abraham will then talk about agriculture, and then Francisco about waste. They'll outline the recommendations that we made in our final advice and what has changed since our advice was published in February. Following that, Charlie Keeling will facilitate a question and answer session. If you think of any questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. First of all, to give everyone an idea of who's online, could you please enter your name, organisation and location into the chat box? It helps from a virtual situation just to get an idea of where people are. But please do remember to put your questions into the Q&A box, as that's where Charlie will draw them from. Before we start, I just want to thank the many of you who participated during engagement and consultation, both leading up to our draft advice, which was published in February, and during the resulting consultation process. Without these many and varied conversations, we couldn't have compiled the evidence base on which we built our advice. So thank you. Over to Sally.
Kia ora everyone, my name's Sally Garden. I'm a principal analyst in the Land and Waste team at the Commission, and I'm just going to do a very brief intro giving a bit of context for our advice on forestry and agriculture and waste. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Charlie. Thanks. Okay, so this is the Commission's first package of advice to the government, and it contains three parts to it. The first part focuses on our advice around the levels of the first three emissions budgets. Part two focuses on advice on the direction of policy to achieve the emissions budgets, so policy for the emissions reductions plan. And the third part is advice on the NDC and eventual reductions in biogenic methane. So we developed our advice through extensive scientific and economic research, modelling, engagement and analysis. We focused very much on meeting all of the requirements under the Climate Change Response Act, and that Act contains a lot of different matters that we're required to consider when preparing our advice. The Act itself sets out the process for us to go through, and the targets themselves are also set out in the Act. And us as the Commission, we provide the independent evidence-based advice on how to meet those targets. So our analysis and advice shows that there are ambitious, achievable and equitable paths to meeting the emissions reduction targets in the Act. That enduring climate action is affordable, that Aotearoa can reduce emissions to meet its targets while continuing to grow the economy and improve well-being. And also our analysis shows that transformational and lasting change is not only necessary but possible. And that's not just about meeting the 2050 emissions reductions targets, but also sustaining them beyond 2050. And our analysis also shows that the technology and the tools Aotearoa needs to reach its climate targets already exist. So as part of our analysis, we looked at each sector and looked at the evidence closely to understand how fast Aotearoa can move within the real world constraints that exist. And our advice reflects the position that Aotearoa is in after many years of sort of short-term thinking and delay around climate policies. So emissions won't go down immediately. There's work to do to lay the groundwork to really start the change that needs to happen. Thanks, Charlie. The next one. This slide shows the level of emissions in Aotearoa in 2019 based on the most recent inventory, and then the level of emissions that we recommend for the first 3 emissions budgets. So each emissions budget would see progressively deeper emissions reductions. So as part of our process for developing our advice, we modelled different paths that could deliver our recommended budgets, and that shows that there are multiple different ways that they could be met under a range of different circumstances. So that shows that there is some flexibility and they are achievable. So our modelling shows that our recommended budgets could see Aotearoa reducing long-lived greenhouse gas emissions by 63% by 2035 and biogenic methane emissions by 16% by 2035. Our recommended emissions budgets look slightly different than the emissions budgets in our draft advice. The level has increased slightly, and that's due to a few things. Firstly, a few updates to our modelling and assumptions based on new evidence we received through consultation. Also due to an increase in baseline emissions following new measurements in the greenhouse gas inventory, the 2019 data, and changes around the way we measure our emissions. So our conclusion was that current government policies do not put Aotearoa on track to meet our recommended emissions budgets or the 2050 targets, and we need to really fundamentally change the way Aotearoa responds to climate change. And our focus has really been on the need to reduce gross emissions. The emissions trading scheme is an important tool, but there are some changes that are needed and other policies are needed in all sectors to complement it. And Sandra, Ben and Francisco will talk you through some of those specific policy recommendations we make around forestry and waste and agriculture. And I just wanted to, because this has been a very, very quick intro to this context, I wanted to note that there will be a webinar focusing specifically on the emissions budgets and the modelling and impacts, and that will be on June the 22nd at 2 p.m. if you want to register for that webinar. I'll hand over to my colleagues now.
Kia ora koutou. Well, I'll start with removals instead of emissions. We're going to talk about forests and other removals, and these are our set of recommendations in the final advice. So forests at the moment are the only option that we have now for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at a scale, and that's the key word there. There are other options, but they have been tested at a scale. This means that we need to strategically think or manage our forests to provide a long-term carbon sink for Aotearoa, rather than using them as the primary tool to meet our targets, like the current case. So to achieve this, we have recommended first a comprehensive national program to establish more native forests. And as Sally mentioned, our demonstration path considers 300,000 hectares between now and 2035. So these will remove emissions beyond 2050 and provide multiple co-benefits, such as cultural biodiversity, erosion control, and water quality. And one point here of clarification is that these forests can be established through a combination of methods. It could be reversion, for example, with activities such as fencing and planting, and pest control, and planting. So both reversion and planting in areas that are not classified currently as forests. So this is in the context of this recommendation. The second recommendation refers to amendments to the New Zealand ETS. And here it's important to note that exotic afforestation is key in our advice, both for carbon sequestration and to feed the bioeconomy. We use a demonstration path again, and we see there 300,000 hectares of more exotic afforestation before now and 2035. So these are the same trends as in the forecast under current policies. Exotic afforestation only starts to depart from afforestation under current policies after 2030. So this gives the government a lot of time to decide how we'll make changes to the ETS. And I note here that we also have a new recommendation, cross-cutting recommendation about the bioeconomy where forests fit into. So I'm not going to talk about details on this recommendation. This will be discussed later on today, and the link will be posted in the chat. So again, point of clarification, we have modeled exotic production forests and permanent native forests, but that doesn't mean that those are the two only options. There are a range of possible options of forest management and species as well, but we haven't delved in detail into the advice, but there are a little bit more on that on the evidence, on the supporting evidence report. So the third recommendation is the government should clarify the role of permanent exotic forests in our transition and develop and amend policies to deliver against this. While these forests could help in our transition, some regional communities are concerned about these forests being established at large scale and for carbon only. So permanent forests do require management, ongoing management to become permanent, but not as much as production forests. So potentially there is a reduction of income and employment compared with production forests or potentially other land uses. The fourth recommendation is about effective and integrated pest management to help establish new forests and maintain carbon in existing forests. So we have seen a lot of evidence about ungulates, deer and goats that can quickly destroy the new forest and compromise existing forests. The fifth recommendation is about considering ways to allow more flexibility for Maori collectives with pre-1990 forests under whenua. The land that has been returned to Maori through Treaty of Waitangi, it has been with restrictions for areas that have pre-1990 forests. So a system may be required in some cases to use existing flexibility provisions under the New Zealand ETS. And this will allow Maori to exert rangatiratanga and mana motuhake and to achieve their aspirations in these particular areas. And 6 is to maintain and increase other carbon stocks. And this refers not just to forests per se, but trees on farms and things like that. So this includes a range of things that may not be able to be accounted for in the targets at the moment. And this includes things like improving and enforcing measures to reduce deforestation of pre-1990 native forests. Another one is to protect and increase carbon stocks of pre-1990 forests through activities such as pest and fire control and enrichment planting, encourage carbon removals, but new and additional small blocks of trees and vegetation. And within that, it could be riparian forest, for example, and preventing further loss of carbon from organic soils, particularly due to the degradation of drained peatlands and the destruction of wetlands. So these are all good things to do, even though they cannot be accounted for in targets that we recommend we should do. Next slide, please. So what are the changes in our final advice? We have a couple of new recommendations, and that's about the integrated pest management and the recommendation of flexibility for Maori collectives. Those two are new. The others have, for example, in the first one about ETS, we have become more explicit in terms of what we mean by that. And then we have also lifted a recommendation, for example, about the carbon stocks. Before we said like we should evaluate approaches to do, to explore how to do this. And this is the last one, for example, small blocks of trees, but now we actually said we should be doing these things as well. So thank you very much. And I pass on to Ben, who's going to talk about agriculture.
Kia ora, Sandra. Hi, everybody. Great. So I'll run through briefly our recommendations on agriculture, as well as some of the changes that we've made. And just to reiterate Sandra's point that while we're covering things here and highlighting changes that have been made in our advice, we've also been updating and made changes in the supporting evidence, which is also available on our website. And there are dedicated chapters on waste, forests and removals, and agriculture. So I encourage everyone to check those out for more detail too. But ultimately, our recommendations around agriculture are still, based on the idea that Aotearoa has been a leader in agricultural efficiency in recent years, and so it's in a strong position to take further action to reduce emissions and contribute to meeting the 2050 targets. And our analysis still shows in our final advice that it is possible for Aotearoa to meet its 2030 and the lower end of its 2050 biogenic methane reduction targets without new, as of yet unavailable technologies for agriculture. And agriculture is able to itself meet in its own way the 10% target by 2030 and that lower end by 2050 with the technologies we have available, if the best practices can be more widely adopted to improve efficiency alongside some land use change. And so ultimately our recommendations are summarized here, and they really, the first one is about following through on the commitment to implement a pricing mechanism to incentivize those on-farm emissions reductions. Now that needs to, of course, be a pricing mechanism that is tailored to the needs of the sector, while also being, of sufficient robustness to actually drive the change that's required. And as well as being tailored to the needs of the sector, also needs to take into account the specific needs of Māori collectives as well. Farmers also will need support. Farmers and growers need support to help implement changes. And so in our advice, you'll see there's detail on this around supporting advisory services, as well as improving digital connectivity. Removing barriers to the deployment of emerging technologies remains part of our recommendations. And that includes things such as streamlining food safety regulation. The fourth one there is about facilitating market acceptability of our low emissions food and fiber products. And so we need to do work to continue to demonstrate the environmental credentials of our products to consumers overseas. And then this last recommendation here is about investing to create options for deeper emissions reductions in the future. And so there's a few parts to that. There's about, one of those is developing a long-term plan for research and development. That's make sure that the R&D we're doing is going to support achieving those targets that we have. There's, further invest in that research and development as well, both for technologies, but also to improve our understanding of potential practice changes that can be done in the agriculture sector as well. And the third one is also investing in the kind of infrastructure and systems needed for diversifying into alternative low emissions land uses, such as further horticulture and arable farming. We know that expansions in those sectors face a number of barriers around whether it's water or labor and things like that, and other types of infrastructure. So laying that groundwork is sort of another stage to it. So you can really summarize the recommendations as, support farmers to take actions immediately to reduce emissions with the farming systems that we have today by optimizing those, making them as efficient as possible, supporting that with services and pricing, then also laying the groundwork for deeper emissions reductions and more fundamental changes through research and development and infrastructure. So those are our recommendations. If we go on to the next slide, I'll highlight a few of the changes in our final advice. This includes, importantly, adjustment to some of our assumptions about the emissions that can be reduced through sort of on-farm practice changes. And you can find details of the changes to our modeling and assumptions and the quite extensive materials we've uploaded to our website about all of our modeling and all of our scenarios, and all the assumptions for all the scenarios, all available in the juicy detail for those who want to get into them. We also tested some more paths with further land use change into horticulture. And an important one is that we have provided more clarity about our role and the role of He Waka Ika Noa, and the role it will play in assessing the readiness of the sector for emissions pricing. I think that was a really important piece of context that was perhaps missing from our draft advice. We've also done some more work around trying to understand the potential for deeper reductions in nitrogen fertilizer and what that might mean both for emissions but also for economic impacts on the sector. And you can find probably more detail of that in the supporting evidence, or we have sort of fed that through into our final advice. And related to that is we've also split out the fertilizer emissions and fertilizer use in our modeling, so everyone can see the reductions that are associated with our demonstration path, and that there actually are quite significant reductions in that's kind of linked to this farm system practice changes that we're already recommending. So by splitting that out, it's much easier for people to see and analyze further. And we've also added more information about our role to provide advice related to agriculture emissions pricing in 2022. So that's another key stepping stone, so that while we're making recommendations here now, we're also going to be coming back to this next year with some more focused advice on emissions pricing as well. So those are some of the key changes from the draft report, and looking forward to discussing more on Q&A. Thanks.
Francisco, you're on mute.
Katoa, everyone. Call Francisco Hernandez Aho. Waste accounts for 9% of biogenic methane emissions here in Aotearoa. New Zealanders have told us that they'd like to see more action on waste to reduce biogenic methane emissions and to take action to improve the circularity of our economy. We know that Aotearoa has one of the highest rates of waste generated per person in the OECD, and relatively low rates of waste recovery to options like recycling, anaerobic digestion, and composting. We're in a privileged position where we can learn from what's been tried and tested overseas. This means putting in the waste hierarchy of reducing, reusing, and recycling at the heart of our decision making, and ensuring that any disposal that does occur occurs at landfills where the organic waste is captured through landfill gas capture systems. We've made the following recommendations to reduce both biogenic methane emissions and embodied emissions from waste. We've suggested revising the waste strategy with ambitious goals to reduce waste emissions and increase resource recovery. We've suggested redesigning processes to take out waste at the production stage where possible. For example, designing out unnecessary packaging for consumer products and ensuring that we're using efficient building processes that use fewer materials. We've called for more investment in New Zealand to support New Zealanders and to support communities to reuse and recycle. This includes increasing funding for resource recovery, infrastructure, research, and development. But it also includes providing support for community-level groups and community-level initiatives, for example, that run composting and waste education programs. We know that the quality of data in the waste sector is quite bad, so we've suggested improving data collection across the waste sector, particularly for farm dumps, non-municipal fills, and wastewater treatment plants. We need to regulate so that those who produce and import products are responsible for minimizing their environmental impact. This means things like expanding product stewardship schemes and exploring other measures such as right to repair. We've suggested mandating gas capture at all landfills that accept organic waste. Most of the waste emissions in Aotearoa come from organic waste decaying at landfills. Just 25% of these emissions are from sites that have landfill gas capture. We don't expect this means retrofitting landfill gas capture at all sites. This should be done where feasible, but it also means diverting waste from landfills without gas capture to landfills with gas capture and to recycling options. And last but not least, we need to reduce emissions from F-gases through reducing leakage and enabling low climate impact alternatives. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the changes to our final advice, we've increased our ambition in waste, setting a target to decrease biogenic methane emissions by at least 40% by 2035, up from the 15% reduction target in our 2021 advice for draft consultation. Some of this is because of updates to the New Zealand greenhouse gas inventory, but we also recommended more action in the sector based on things we heard from consultation and from further analysis. We've also moved our circular economy extending beyond waste. We've made explicit that investments in the waste sector should occur, as well as the over and above the increases in the waste levy. More funding is necessary to support the increased level of. And as we mentioned before, we've suggested mandating that all landfills that accept organic waste should have effective gas capture systems by 31st of December 2026. We see this as a proposal to some form of treatment and limited amount of recovery through energy. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Francisco. I should have noted at the start, this webinar has been recorded, so we can publish it on our website at a later date. If you're uncomfortable with it, then please let me know, and we can see what we can do about that. But it's now over to the government to decide whether they accept our advice to shape climate action in Aotearoa. The government has until 31 December this year to consider the Commission's advice, and by this date, the government must have set its emissions budgets and finalised the first emissions reduction plan for Aotearoa, detailing the policies it will use to achieve the budgets. If we don't think the government is doing enough to meet its targets, we will hold it to account. For us, the advice we have just delivered is the first in a cycle. We are around for the long term, and we'll be back with further advice on the next emissions reduction plan in 2023 and the next set of emissions budgets for Aotearoa in 2024. But we're also required to deliver several other pieces of work. From 2022, we'll begin a new work program to monitor how the government's emissions reduction plan is implemented. And soon we'll begin a significant piece of advice on adaptation. This will include monitoring and reporting on how the national adaptation plans for Aotearoa are implemented. The first report on the national adaptation plans is due in 2024, and the Commission is required to deliver the second national climate change risk assessment in 2026. We're also responsible for providing advice on New Zealand's emissions trading scheme, particularly around price control and unit settings in the first half of 2021. In the agriculture area, Ben has already mentioned some of the work we need to get on with immediately. There are two pieces of advice that we need to deliver by June next year. The first is an assessment of He Waka Eke Noa's progress towards its legislative milestones on farm level accounting and reporting of emissions, and the readiness of the sector for pricing of emissions. If progress has been insufficient, the government can bring the agricultural sector, including livestock and fertiliser, into the New Zealand emissions trading scheme at a processor level prior to 2025, when it's currently signalled to join. Secondly, ministers are required to outline a scheme for pricing of agricultural emissions by December 2022. Before this, they're also required to ask the Commission to provide advice on the level of assistance that should be given to the agricultural sector as part of that pricing scheme. Thanks for listening to us give an overview of our advice. It was quite brief. I do encourage you to go and read the report for more detail, and Ben's mentioned the evidence reports that underline if you want to get into some of the more nitty-gritty detail. I'm going to pass over now to Charlie, who's going to help us go through some of those questions. If you've got further questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, as that's where she'll be drawing them from. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you, Phil. Sorry, there we go. I'll just find, I think the first one is for you, Ben. So regarding other carbon stocks, is it likely that there will be specific advice about the value of mangroves and or wetlands? Are mangroves currently considered and counted as a carbon sink?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, and thanks very much, anonymous attendee. Really fantastic question. It's been great that I think throughout our consultation period, we've had a lot of interest in wetlands and mangroves and some of these kind of coastal ecosystems. For the question specifically, mangroves are certainly a carbon sink. I think that's really well understood sort of internationally. In New Zealand, though, we don't have sort of robust estimates of how much of a carbon sink that they are in terms of our data around their carbon sequestration and changes over time is not currently robust at a national level in New Zealand. In terms of our specific advice, we do have specific advice on this, though. One of the things that we actually changed in our sort of forestry and carbon removals advice was we lifted up our advice regarding some of these other carbon stocks, particularly around wetlands, because some wetlands, particularly peatlands that have been drained, are an important source of emissions from the carbon released from those organic soils. And we have now sort of strengthened our recommendation to encourage the government to sort of take action to try and mitigate those emissions from those drained peatlands, whereas we previously just kind of suggested to take a look at it. And alongside some of those actions to mitigate these emissions, which are currently outside of our target accounting framework, we also have a separate recommendation in our sort of accounting section of our advice. We were encouraging the government to improve its accounting systems to be able to better include drained peatlands, potentially mangroves and some ocean ecosystems in the future into our target accounting. So they're definitely important, and we encourage the government to be taking action on both of these fronts, wetlands and mangroves. But we also, have a separate set of advice around the accounting systems that need to continue to be developed.
Thank you, Ben. Sandra, I think this one's for you. Is there any advice around how to include riparian plantings on farms, which may be long and narrow strips? Just thinking how else you can encourage more planting on private lands and potentially get more catchment / larger scale collaborative approaches to planting across several farmers.
Thank you, Susie, for that question. Well, we do have a general recommendation about encouraging carbon removals in small blocks of trees and vegetation. Hopefully that will cover riparian plantings. We do not use the word riparian in the advice, but if we go to the evidence report, the supporting evidence, then riparians are mentioned there. I think that is more up to the emissions reduction plan in terms of what exactly will happen and how to include that. So the advice is, the general is like should be including that and encouraging it, but the details on the actual incentives, that will be more within the emissions reduction plan. I hope that answers the question, unless anyone has something else to add.
Thank you, Sandra. Phil, I think this one might be for you. For native forestry, why not incentivise the establishment of indigenous species for permanent forests by introducing a long-term average carbon growth increment, so annual carbon accrued is more closely aligned with radiator pine? Then those planting for carbon only are more likely to consider indigenous forests for near-term carbon growth.
That's a really good question, and one of the things that we heard a lot during consultation is about what needs to be done to incentivise the planting of native forests. And there are a lot of different ways that it can be done, either through upfront grants or approaches as you've suggested here. I think, as Sandra noted in that previous question, our role is about providing advice on the direction of policy. And so now it's really over to government about how they set up the emissions reduction plan and working through the details of those policies to figure out how it's actually done. There are a lot of considerations and flow-on effects that result from how policy is implemented. So there needs to be a lot of thought put into how it's done and what some of those impacts might be. So that could be a very valid approach, and I'd encourage you to remain engaged with the process as the government picks up the emissions reduction plan and starts developing those policies and have input into that.
Thanks, Phil. Sally, what does the support to farmers and growers look like from the Commission's perspective?
So one of the key things from our perspective with helping farmers make choices to lower their emissions is really more effective advisory services for farmers, sort of helping farmers develop the skills and learn about and adopt best practice. And as I'm sure everyone's very aware, farms differ hugely in terms of where their emissions come from and where the opportunities for reducing emissions on farms are. So also one of the key things really is helping farmers understand their emissions profile, so they have a sort of baseline of where their emissions at, comparing across farms to understand where the biggest improvements can be made and the biggest opportunities are. So there is a real need for more information and data for farmers to be able to do that, and a real need for more really effective advisory services, which is going to require a lot of training and upskilling. And He Waka Ināia has a goal that by the end of 2022 of farmers knowing where their emissions come from and understanding that. So there really is a lot of work that needs to happen to make sure the skills and information are there to help them do that. Also, when it comes to other types of farming, so for example, lower emissions land uses like horticulture has a real opportunity there in some cases, but we know that there are barriers that are getting in the way of expanding horticultural land at the moment, and that's quite a wide range of barriers, including supply chains, labour shortages, skills shortage. So there is work to be done there as well in terms of support to help people who want to change to some of those other land uses do that.
Thanks, Sally. This one I think is for you, Phil. So forest planting rates, exotic and native, have not been met in the past 2 years and are unlikely to do so this year. Yet the Climate Change Commission is suggesting changes to the ETS that may dissuade planting or at least generate uncertainty. What will change to enable planting rates such as 25,000 hectares a year for natives by 2025?
Yeah, so the planting of natives is a is a new one. So that's something that we haven't seen before. The government hasn't put that amount of effort into the planting of natives. So there'll be need to be a bit of thought. Sorry, and I should clarify, it's not all planting of natives. There's also a lot of reversion in there, as Sandra mentioned. So we're talking about 25,000 hectares a year. From reports done by Manaaki Whenua for the Aotearoa Circle, we know that there's around about 740,000 hectares, which if we could keep browsers off that land and keep pests out, then that land would eventually revert to native forests. We'll probably have a slower sequestration rate, but again, we have limited data around that, which we need to build. Regarding exotic forests, we have also heard some concern from the forestry sector that we're now asking the government to change the emissions trading scheme so that we don't get as much exotic afforestation as we would under current policies. I would also note that we're also asking the government to put a significant amount of exotic forests, new exotic forests, so 380,000 hectares more exotic forests. And Sandra mentioned that tracks along with our current policies out to at least 2030. So the point I'm trying to get to is that while we're asking the government to change the emissions trading scheme settings, these changes don't need to start biting until we get into the 2030s. So we're trying to signal well in advance that yes, we do need forests now, and they're important both for carbon sequestration and for the bioeconomy, but we need to be signaling well in advance that as we get into the 2030s, the signals from the emissions trading scheme can't be putting as strong an incentive on planting as they are now. So I think there should be still a lot of confidence from investors that they can invest in forestry over the next 10 years, but also with the awareness that as you get out towards 20 years and out towards 2050, those same climate incentives for exotic afforestation should be starting to wind back a bit.
Thanks, Phil. Ben, what advice are you giving or thinking about in terms of different types of incentives to get the changes you have assumed and or expected?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Susie. I can have a first crack at this, but welcome others to jump in as well. I think it's important to remember overall for this one that we're providing advice on the direction of policy. We're not providing detailed, specific policy recommendations about exactly what those incentives should be. So a lot of our advice does talk about the need to incentivize, and we're not telling the government exactly what those should be because there's more detailed work that needs to go on there. But certainly that we know that for both, starting with agriculture, the emissions pricing is going to be really, really important, and we try to really put that up front in our advice. And then as well as that, we have information around providing additional supporting services to help enable farmers and growers to take action in response to those pricing signals. And of course, emissions prices will also be important when it comes to forestry. But we also, I think when it comes to native forestry, it's probably pretty clear that there might be some additional incentives that are required if you're looking to achieve the balance of establishment between both natives and exotic forests, which have very different sort of carbon sequestration rates. So maybe there's a need for additional incentives there. People have talked a lot about biodiversity credits and perhaps some incentives related to that. We don't get into the detail of what those incentives could be, but certainly pricing is going to be pretty critical for both agriculture and forestry. But yeah, there may be need for more ones as well, but that's sort of the government's task to work out in detail what those additional specific incentives and policies should be. If anyone else wants to jump in there, feel free.
Thanks, Ben. Doesn't sound like any takers. So the next one, Francisco, I think is for you. Will the Commission be making available the research and additional data which led to your decision to lift the waste sector target from 15 to 40%?
Yes, most of it is already available via these supporting evidence chapters of the evidence report. And we'll also be looking at releasing the submissions from stakeholders, the ones that have consented to make their submission public over the next month or so, and along with our analysis of that. So yes, we will be making a lot of those information public.
And what's the reason for increasing the target?
We increased the target because from the analysis we've done and the public interest in the area, we concluded that people wanted waste to do more, and the waste sector could do more with a lot of low regret options, such as mandating gas capture at all landfills that accept organic waste, and also moving to a more circular economy.
Thanks, Francisco. I've got another one here for you as well. The Commission's recommendation that organic waste should go to landfills with landfill gas capture appears to be at odds with the waste disposal levy expansion, which incentivises disposal of waste to class 2 to 4 landfills, which don't often have gas capture. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's something we discussed in the chapter, the waste chapter of the advice report. We highlighted the potential for that waste levy expansion to incentivize the disposal of waste from landfills with gas capture to landfills without. And that's why we've put in a suggestion that by 2026 that landfills that you're not able to send organic waste to landfills that don't have effective gas capture systems. And we've also suggested that the government look at other regulations and incentives to prevent it from happening.
Thanks, Francisco. Phil, all these agriculture recommendations support a proper scheme for biological emissions and sinks in food production systems. Why don't we start there? Both PCE and the Productivity Commission's climate report stated as such. It feels like we are down in the detail before setting up the framework first.
Yeah, this is a common question we got as well, and inherently it's not a bad idea. I mean, so I think what you're getting at here, Paul, is that why don't we, at a national level, offset our biological emissions with other land sequestration? So, for example, methane from agriculture could be offset by trees on farms. I think where we're at is that the Zero Carbon Bill, or Zero Carbon Act, Climate Change Response Act, has clearly set out some targets that we've agreed upon as a country, where we've got some biological methane targets and some long-lived gas targets. And the point is now that we need to get on with actually implementing those and getting some action on the ground. Government is working on policies to do that, for example, through the He Waka Ināia process that it's already been talked about. And one of the things that He Waka Ināia is looking at is whether at a farm level, which is different from a national level, at a farm level, you might be able to use sequestration on farm to offset biological emissions. And I think that's probably what most individual farmers are worried about, is whether they can look at their operation as a whole and the carbon balance of that. But as a country, we have set different targets. We've tried to recognise the different nature of methane as a gas, that it's a short-lived gas. And so that's why it's got the reduce and stabilise target. And the point is now just to get on with some action on the ground and start reducing emissions.
Thanks, Phil. Sally, do we see a need for advisory services for iwi Māori?
Hi, yes, thanks, Maxine, for asking this question, because it's something I should have mentioned in my previous answer. Yes, we heard very clearly that there is a need for farm advisory services targeted specifically at Māori landowners. There are some specific complexities around collective Māori land ownership and things like that mean there are specific, that there is a need for services tailored specifically towards the needs of whenua that is owned by Māori. So that's definitely something that we see a need for. And it's going to require, it's going to take a while to develop that, because of specific skills and data and information that will be needed, but it's a gap at the moment that definitely needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Sally. Francisco, what is recommended for the reduction of waste creation?
Yeah, so the Commission provided a high-level policy direction to reduce waste generation at source, and the specific instruments that we suggested could be used to effect that include redesigning waste at source, making things like building buildings more efficient, and phasing out things like unnecessary packaging, and even considering product bans, for example, banning junk waste could reduce the paper waste stream by up to potentially up to 25–30%.
Thanks, Francisco. And another one here for you. Does the recommendation on landfill gas capture at landfills include construction and demolition class 2 landfills which accept timber?
Yes, the recommendation to ensure that any remainder organic waste goes to landfills with effective gas capture applies to all landfills. We know that class 3 to 4 landfills already accept very little organic waste. And class 2 landfills are the bulk, accept the bulk of organic waste in the sort of non-municipal space. I also wanted to highlight at this stage that the recommendation to mandate that all remainder organic waste go to landfill with effective gas capture systems do not apply to farm fills, just the sort of class 2 to 4 sites.
Thanks, Francisco. Phil, has the Commission considered other ways of land use rather than conventional use of land for horticulture, such as vertical farming practices?
Yeah, so we looked at some of this when we were putting together our evidence, and I think one of the things with this is that it's a lot more, at least the ways we looked at it, it was a lot more expensive to approach production in this manner. And where we actually have limits around conversion to horticulture, expansion of horticulture or arable in general, is more about access to things like labour, water, markets, and so on. So it's not so much about whether we've got the land area available, it's a lot of the other supporting inputs that need to be addressed. And that's where we've got a recommendation specifically about that, which is to look at how these barriers can be addressed so that these options become available as we get towards some of the latter emissions budgets out to the 2030s and 2040s.
Thanks, Phil. Another one here for you. Investment in plantation forestry has long time horizons, signalling changes to the ETS to disincentivise afforestation in 10 years' time is only a third of the way through the first rotation. This signal creates huge uncertainty for investors and will suppress afforestation in exotics now. Is that a deliberate strategy reflecting social preference rather than science?
So what we're saying is that we need to get these trees in the ground, and we need the afforestation out until the mid 2030s at least, and still some afforestation through into the 2030s and 2040s. A lot of what you're describing there, Peter, depends on how the government implements these policies, and so one thing that we need to be quite careful of as the government goes through and develops the emissions reduction plan and resulting policies is that it doesn't disincentivise afforestation happening now. So, for example, you could plant a forest now or in 2025, and if you know that you're going to get NZUs through until that forest reaches its average carbon stock, then you know you're going to get that full carbon revenue for the planting of that forest. So our advice is saying that government should design policies so that we get this amount of afforestation. And if the government said, well, you're only going to get NZUs for the first 5 or 10 years of your rotation, then that's not going to happen. So we need to be quite careful about how the government actually develops the details of these policies to make sure that we do get the outcomes that we're saying in our advice.
Thanks, Phil. Sandra, there are currently knowledge, capability and infrastructure gaps that will hinder reaching the targets for planting native species. What can be done to address this?
Thank you, Jackie, for that question. Actually, it's very important to know that it's not a target for planting, it's a target for establishment of natives. So that includes reversion, and that we are thinking that it's mostly reversion because it's the most cost-effective method, and then planting. So that's the second, and that's more expensive. So, but yes, there are capabilities and infrastructure constraints. But remember, again, we are about direction of policy, and the details should be under the emissions reduction plan. Having said that, there is a lot of coordination that needs to get done, especially with regional councils, for example. They do hold some data in terms of land uses that can help identify specific areas. And then we need to go down to catchment level. So all those kind of details should be worked with government. So I encourage people, if they do have the data, as for example, Tane Tree Trusts do, to connect with government agencies that are in charge of the ERP plans, so their ideas get reflected into those. So mapping areas is one thing, prioritizing species, of course, working with people who live there, and also with iwi Maori as well. So everything is combined. So I think that's mainly what I'm thinking about. But yes, we also have a recommendation on research and development that we need to build that capability across all sectors. But this area of native forest is crucial. Right now, the 1 billion trees program already has some projects ongoing that hopefully will reduce the cost of planting. But going back to the first, it's not just planting, it's a lot of reversion, and that's a lot cheaper and easier as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Francisco, I've got one for you here. Organic waste includes demolition materials such as wood, food waste, and green waste, such as garden refuse, urban tree removals, and pruning. Demolition is industrial. Food waste will increase with housing intensification, and garden refuse will decrease with housing intensification. How will these be separately dealt with at landfill?
We recommend that a lot of these things are dealt with before landfill. That's why we've recommended accelerating investment in infrastructure for waste collection, processing, and resource recovery. We know that part of the reason why a lot of our waste goes to landfill is that we haven't set up this sort of separate collection and processing sort of infrastructures so that we can have reprocess things like food and garden waste into high quality feedstock and ensure that that waste isn't being commingled, which reduces the value of it at the resource recovery stage. So that's how we deal with it.
Thanks, Francisco. Phil, will the Commission be attending field days this week to meet and speak to farmers and growers about their proposals?
Yeah, so I think this was in regards to one of the earlier questions about support that would be given to farmers to help reduce their emissions. Unfortunately, we won't be attending field days. We are trying to get out and about, but we don't have the resources. Didn't have the resources to get up to field days for this week. He Waka Ināia is working on how these policies will work at a farm level. We do have a role in monitoring of He Waka Ināia and reporting on their progress. And so we are going to try and get out and talk to a lot of people on the ground about how that advice or how that work is progressing and whether it is hitting the mark. No, we won't be at field days, but yes, we are trying to get around and talk to farmers about our advice.
Thanks, Phil. I think another one for you here. So it refers to a previous question, but the point being asked was that plantation forest industry was barely meeting the Commission's desired targets already, and there are numerous blockages on the horizon via the RMA. Included would be the possibility that large areas of plantations become plantations biodiversity areas, which could accrue significant incalculable future risks. How is the Commission going to monitor and recommend on identified blockages?
Yeah, so firstly, I want to point out that we do have some other recommendations throughout the report where we talk about climate policy being aligned with other policies such as resource management policy. And secondly, I'll also point out that we now pick up a monitoring role. So we keep an eye on what government is doing, both in the climate area, but more broadly as well, to see whether Aotearoa is on track to meet our emissions budgets as we've outlined. So we do have a role where we monitor government's progress, and we can report it when we report on that progress. We don't have a legislative stick that we can beat the government with, but what we can do is we can take an evidence-based approach, an independent evidence-based approach, look at what government's happening, look at what government is doing, what effect that is having on the ground, and try and make that clear to help with democratic pressure on the government.
Thanks, Phil. We've probably got time for just one more, and I've got one here for you, Ben. Have the agriculture emissions calculations included emissions from things like effluent management, particularly as recent research suggests that these emissions may have been substantially underestimated in the past?
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Liam, for the great question. Yes, so the emissions estimates for agriculture certainly do include effluent management. They try to basically provide a comprehensive picture. They include fertilizer emissions, the soil emissions, effluent management, the enteric fermentation, and in our sort of data that we post online, you can actually see the breakdown by some of those key categories. And we sort of work very closely with the teams at Ministry for the Environment and Primary Industries in terms of understanding the greenhouse gas inventory. And it's important to note that that inventory continues to get updated over time, and some of the emissions factors and things will change as new research comes to light with the trends that you're suggesting. And this actually happened this year. You'll notice that the agricultural total emissions have gone up in our final advice compared to our draft advice, and that was because of changes to the greenhouse gas inventory and changes to our understanding of agricultural emissions. And I think there have been some updates to our understanding of pasture quality, which was actually associated with greater emissions. And so those then get fed back into the greenhouse gas inventory and will be sort of fed back into our own emissions calculations as well. So this kind of continual process of updating based on the new research as it comes available is very much a part of our process.
Thanks, Ben. I think that's all the questions we have time for. So I'm going to hand back over to Phil to close us off. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your thoughtful questions, interactions. We really appreciate the engagement that we've had with many stakeholders across the country. As I said before, we don't now disappear. We've got many other roles that we pick up, including coming back and revisiting our advice on emissions reduction plan and emissions budgets. We look to continue our engagement with you as we go through that and our other work programs. So we look forward to further interactions with you. I'm going to hand over to Ben to do a final closing karakia and ka kite anō.
Hari I roto I te maramatanga, hari I roto te rangimarie, tā kua tō wairua, kia tō te rangimarie, kia tātou katoa. Hau pai marire. Tēnā koutou.
Thank you. And if you've got any further questions, do get in touch.
Thanks, everyone.